Durkheim says that you need a certain mechanic solidarity to build even modern societies. This is reflected, for instance, in the fact that even in modern knowledge societies, we need a kind of core knowledge base that everyone shares in. So everyone needs to know how to work with money, right? How that works. Everyone needs to roughly know how language is used, perhaps how just interactions with a stranger work in a society, basically norms of human behavior in a society. So all of this is basically still part of the mechanic solidarity slash sort of a non-differentiated knowledge part in modern knowledge societies. But then these societies are also fragmented in these very different provinces of meanings. So the sociology of knowledge is haunted by the problem of social determinism, and I mentioned this already. And this goes probably back to Karl Marx's famous statement that social reality or social being determines consciousness, where sort of the substructure, the materialism determines the superstructure, as represented, for instance, in that statement, just example statement. Well, you're wrong. Sort of your knowledge is wrong because you're a capitalist. And this, let's say, social determinism in the very strong sense is obviously a problem for the sociology of knowledge, because the sociology of knowledge is itself obviously a second order kind of knowledge that needs to respond to claims about it being true or false. And if it itself is only socially determined, it's a little bit questionable whether it can still, when you follow a strong program of the sociology of science, whether it can still hold up to being a scientific discipline at all that makes statements about things being true or false. And so one way to rescue the sociology of knowledge from that sort of self-referential problem about its own foundations is to keep in mind that there is a clear distinction between the context of discovery and the context of justification. That is, how you get to obtain a certain kind of knowledge is sort of one thing. How you justify whether that knowledge is right or wrong is another thing. Or in more philosophical terms, if you think that there is an empirical context dependence of knowledge, then this does not have to imply also a normative relativism about knowledge. So if you're a capitalist, you obviously have certain beliefs and ideas and norms. And this is easily explicable because you were raised perhaps in a capitalist family, you have your own factory, etc., or you have stocks. But then this is a different kind of question. This is just the context of discovery of sort of capitalist knowledge when compared to the question of whether the knowledge that a capitalist holds is justified or not. Yeah? So in other terms, even a capitalist can have sort of a justified knowledge about capitalism. Yeah? And this is a different kind of claim when compared to the claim about the causal genesis of knowledge. So I already mentioned Karl Mannheim, who had a solution of his own for this challenge of the sociology of knowledge being itself determined by states and societies. And his solution was then these free-floating intellectuals, right, which were sort of able to cut the link that social determinism used to tie them to social reality. And I mentioned Julian Bender as someone who accused intellectual of treason, also in the wake of fascism, and was very much doubting the potential of these free-floating intellectuals. So these are very philosophical discussions about, let's say, the problem of self-referentiality of the sociology of knowledge. And more empirically, it's perhaps interesting to note that there are empirical studies that show correlations or conditional correlations at most between certain states in societies, so social conditions, class, gender, race, what have you, and the kind of knowledge people defend. So when you only have academics in parliaments, right, there's a tendency of parliaments to become too academic when compared to representation of the voting population, then you might also have a loss of certain standpoints, of viewpoints, perspectives in parliament. If you have CEOs who are only male, then this can produce also different standpoints and a loss of sort of more diverse standpoints in the most important companies of our societies. Yeah? Or if in academia there is a lack, for instance, of African Americans amongst sociologists in the US, then this may also have real consequences on how, let's say, dominant notions and concepts are understood in sociology. So there are obviously these correlations, and the sociology of knowledge nowadays does not necessarily engage in these perennial disputes about whether it's even possible to do or not due to the challenge of self-referentiality. But there are simply these studies, right, about what parliamentarians, members of parliament, think, dependent on their class background, for instance. But there is also this strong program in the sociology of knowledge by Bloor, for instance, that would also defend a very strong radical relativist stance, such that any kind of knowledge, including the sociology of knowledge, basically cannot make very strong statements about basically truth, because it's all dependent on the context. All right, so philosophical anthropology as one input, the sociology of everyday kind of knowledge as the other input, for then this classical work in sociology of Birger Luckmann, the reading for today also, who wrote a book whose main points can probably be summarized in this quote here, that society is a human product, society is an objective reality, and man is a social product. Yeah? And I summarized sort of the main argument of this book, a theory also of social reality, in this rather complex graph, which you can read on the one hand here, bottom up, right? From sort of everyday kind of micro contexts up towards first order institutions, right, that involve many individuals, up to second order institutions, which you may also refer to a little bit as the superstructure in Karl Marx. So any kind of legitimizing institutions that are on top of these first order institutions. So this is a kind of bottom up logic. So let's start simply with an example and go through these main notions of how society is constructed then in a dynamic, also you may even say dialectical process, because we start again with a Hegelian image, if you want, of two sort of subjective consciousnesses, that is actors who are carriers of a perception of subjective consciousness, and who start to interact with each other in a very bottom-up way in everyday life, in face-to-face interactions. Think about, for instance, you living in a shared flat with your student friends, and you just arrived in Berlin, and you moved in together, you don't know each other very well, and now you sort of have to organize a living in that shared flat. And so one thing that probably comes up then is that, I mean, there are certain tasks to be done in a shared living arrangement. Someone has perhaps to buy some products, there's cleaning tasks, the notorious cleaning tasks, etc. And while interacting on an everyday basis, there are, let's say, certain simply regularities that come into place, yeah, or what Birger Luckmann then referred to as there's a certain habitualization of actions going on. Yeah, so I know that you are always the first to get up. So you are the first to use the bathroom, but then you're also the one who prepares the breakfast, for instance. And yes, I'm rather sort of the night owl, right? So I sort of make sure that, I don't know, the door is properly closed at the end of the day, and so on. Yeah, so there are certain rituals, if you want, that take place, and this is something that is started to be taken for granted, and an important notion in Birger Luckmann and phenomenology more generally to describe the process of habitualization and, yeah, in a way, this background building process of, let's say, the first torso of institutions. It's not a ready institution yet. Because what needs to happen for it to become more institutionalized in the Birger Luckmann sense is also like a double typification. Yeah? Double because, first of all, there needs to be a typification of actors, and then there needs to be one of actions themselves. So the action typification goes on already in our shared flat example, right? Where I have then the role of, for instance, grocery shopping, right? So these are sort of the types of actions that I'm realizing, whereas your job is rather to do some of the cleaning in the kitchen, and in a way you're realizing these actions then as a type, yeah, and reciprocality comes in then in that we mutually recognize that when you do the cleaning, right, I do the grocery shopping, and there's a certain mutual understanding going on, negotiated on an everyday kind of basis, that there is this implicit division of labor. Yeah, right, that we can organize even without us writing a constitutional treaty of our shared flat. The second kind of typification then of actors comes in once we generalize our living arrangement a bit further. So imagine that one of our sort of shared flat members is replaced. There's a new candidate. Yeah, she is sort of applying at our shared flat party, and sort of she then moves into sort of the empty room, but also position of the member we have lost. And in a way, there is the type of actor, right, of this first member that is already creating an institutional, if you want, role expectation with regard to also this division of labor. And there's the new member then also has to, yeah, sort of live up to these expectations. But sort of this is also a moment when the actors involved here have a certain awareness about the implicit order that had existed only in everyday life implicitly, and that now also comes a little bit to the fore of intention. So the first instance of institution building,